It's January 6, 2007. A young couple in Dallas has one errand before the family dinner. Pick up a car from the mechanic that was only 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes away. They park the Explorer, leave the keys in the ignition, leave their phones on the seat, and walk up to the door, but they never come back. A month later, their bodies are found dumped under a bridge, stripped and with evidence of torture. Linoshka Torres was 18 years old and 6 months pregnant. Luis Campos was 20. Neither of them had a criminal record, and neither of them had ever crossed paths with a cartel. But someone told the Gulf Cartel they had stolen $40,000 worth of drugs. It was all a lie, after a frightened mechanic pointed his finger at the first outsiders he could think of, just to protect himself from a violent boss. And Luis and Linoshka paid for that lie with everything they had. This is the story of two innocent people who were tortured and killed by a Mexican drug cartel because they were in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and someone needed someone to blame. To understand this story, you have to understand who these two people actually were, not as victims, not as names on a police report, but as real people with real lives and real futures ahead of them. Luis Campos had immigrated from Mexico as a child. He grew up in the Dallas area, and like a lot of kids from immigrant families, he learned early how to work. By the time he was 20, he was pulling warehouse shifts at an auto parts distribution center, stacking boxes, filling orders, putting in the kind of quiet, honest work that nobody notices until it stops getting done. He wasn't loud about it. Luis was one of those guys who let his character speak through what he showed up for, day after day. But his real identity, that was on the soccer field. Luis Campos could play, and not in that casual Sunday league kind of way. People who watched him described someone who moved differently, someone whose feet seemed to think faster than the other players. He was the type of striker who could make a defensive line look confused just by changing pace. Soccer was the thing that made him electric. Off the field, he was quiet, steady, the kind of guy who showed up to things early and stayed until the end. Linoshka Torres, everyone called her Lynn, was the opposite energy in the best possible way. She was sharp, social, always talking, always laughing. Her family described her as the glue, the one who kept everyone connected. She grew up Puerto Rican in a working-class Dallas suburb, and she moved through life with a confidence that came from genuinely caring about people. At North Garland High School, she was an honor roll student. She had plans to study social work, to work with families, to do something that mattered. The teachers who knew her remembered a girl who stayed after class to ask questions, not because she was confused, but because she was curious. Luis and Linoshka met at a community soccer game when she was 16. He was 17, playing in his element, and she was there watching with family. The way relatives told it later, it was the kind of meeting that didn't take long to become something real. Over the next couple of years, they became everything to each other. Their families merged. Luis's mother cooked for Linoshka like she'd always been there. Linoshka helped Luis practice his English, helped him navigate the paperwork and the language barriers that came with being an immigrant in the American system. By late 2006, they had moved into a small apartment in Mesquite, just east of Dallas. They were building something, a life. Linoshka was 6 months pregnant, and they were already doing all the things young parents do, setting up a corner of the apartment, talking about names, dreaming about what she would look like. They also volunteered, both of them, at the Salvation Army on weekends, giving time to something outside themselves. Neither of them had a criminal record. Neither of them had any ties to gang life, to drug distribution, to any of the networks that run quietly through certain parts of Dallas. They were, and I want to be precise about this because it matters, completely, entirely innocent of anything that was about to happen to them. And they were about to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Three Kings Day, January 6th, is one of the most important celebrations in Hispanic culture. It marks the end of the Christmas season, the arrival of the Magi, and in most families, it's the day for gathering, for food, for gifts, for everyone crowding into someone's living room and being loud and joyful together. For Linoshka's family, it was a big deal. She had called her sister Rachel earlier in the day to say they were running a little late, just needed to swing by and grab Luis's car from the mechanic. They'd be there soon. That mechanic worked out of a house in a neighborhood called Pleasant Grove in southeast Dallas, a working-class area. Close-knit, the kind of block where people know which cars belong and which ones don't. The mechanic's name was Jorge Guzman Banda. Luis had used him before. He offered discount rates, and Luis liked him fine. Trusted him enough to leave his dad's car there while the transmission got sorted out. There was nothing about that Saturday that suggested danger, Luis drove his dad's red Ford Explorer over to pick up his own vehicle. Lenoshka came along. She called her sister during the drive. She sounded normal, excited for the celebration. The plan was simple: 10, maybe 15 minutes at most. Walk up, get the keys, drive home, change clothes, head to the family dinner. When they pulled up to the mechanic's house, they parked the Explorer in the driveway. They left the keys in the ignition. They left their cell phones on the seat. They walked up to the door. That was the last normal moment of their lives. Because what Luis and Lenoshka didn't know, what they had absolutely no way of knowing, was that the man they trusted with the car was also connected to one of the most dangerous criminal organizations operating in North Texas. And 3 weeks earlier, that organization had been robbed, and someone needed to answer for it. Here's what you need to understand about the Gulf Cartel's reach in 2006-2007 Dallas. When most people think about cartel violence, they picture border towns, Matamoros, Nuevo Laredo, the Rio Grande Valley. And yes, that's where the Gulf Cartel was headquartered, based in Tamaulipas, Mexico, directly across from South Texas. But their network didn't stop at the border. By the mid-2000s, the Gulf Cartel was the primary organized crime threat in North Texas, according to federal law enforcement. They had semi-autonomous cells operating in Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston. These cells didn't look like movie gangsters with gold chains and AR-15s strapped to their backs. They looked like small business owners, mechanics, warehouse workers, people blending into ordinary neighborhoods, moving product quietly, sending money south. The cartel's enforcement wing at that time was Los Zetas, former Mexican military special forces who had been recruited by Gulf Cartel boss Ociel Cardenas Guillen. These were men trained in surveillance, in psychological pressure, in tactical violence. When Cardenas was arrested in 2003 and the organization restructured, those methods spread through the entire network. The culture became discipline above everything. If something went wrong, if product went missing, if money disappeared, someone had to answer for it, fast and brutally, because hesitation in that world was read as weakness. In late December 2006, something went wrong. A burglary at the home of a Gulf Cartel cell operator named Nicolas Monarez. Roughly $40,000 worth of drugs and cash, gone, stolen from his house. Monarez was a Mexican national who had been running part of the Dallas sales operations. He was not a man who let things go. He was not a man who shrugged and absorbed a loss. He needed to recover the product, or he needed to punish someone for the theft, or both. Because in the structure he operated in, a theft that went unanswered was a sign that you could be robbed again. It was an invitation for more problems. So Monarez started asking around, and this is where the mechanic, Jorge Guzman Banda, enters the story in a way that would destroy 2 innocent lives. Banda was scared. He knew Monarez. He knew what happened to people who couldn't answer the boss's questions. So when Monarez came to him and asked whether he'd seen anyone suspicious, whether he had any leads on who might have taken the drugs, Banda needed an answer. He needed someone to point to, and Luis Campos had recently been at his house. That's it. That's the entire foundation of what's about to happen. A young man got his transmission fixed at the wrong shop. Banda told Monarez that the couple who'd come to pick up a car had been acting strangely, that they seemed suspicious. There is absolutely no evidence, none, that Luis or Lenoshka had anything to do with the theft. They weren't in the neighborhood on the right dates. They had no knowledge of the drugs, no motive, no connection to any of it. But Monarez didn't need evidence. He needed a target, and the seeds of the catastrophic, irreversible mistake had just been planted. When Luis called ahead to confirm the car was ready, Guzman Banda told him to come by that evening. Come by, it's ready, see you soon. He had set them up. Around dusk, Luis and Lenoshka arrived. Guzman Banda let them in, kept them talking, kept them calm. And then another car pulled up, Nicolas Monarez, 29 years old, a man with a reputation for violence and zero patience. He came with his associate Frank Estrella, a 20-year-old gang member. They were armed. What happened next, according to court records pieced together later, happened fast. Monarez and Estrella burst in, guns drawn, no explanation, no negotiation, just sudden, absolute chaos. Luis and Lenoshka were ordered to the ground. They were bound with the duct tape. They were dragged out. They were loaded into the trunk of a car. Lenoshka had time to be terrified. Luis had time to understand in some awful instant that whatever was happening was real and not stopping. The red Ford Explorer sat in the driveway, keys in the ignition, cell phones on the seat, engine off. A car that never moved again until police came. The family waited at the Three Kings Day celebration. An hour passed, then 2. They tried calling. No answer. They called again. Nothing. Rachel Torres, Linoshka's sister, felt the dread settling in the way dread does. First as irritation, then confusion, then something cold and nameless that spreads through your chest. Where are they? Nobody knew. But inside a shed connected to Monarez's girlfriend's house in Oak Cliff, just a few miles away, two people were learning what it felt like to be completely, utterly at the mercy of someone who didn't care about the truth. This is the part of the story that you have to sit with, because it defines everything. Luis and Linoshka were not the targets of a planned hit. They weren't caught in a war between rival factions. They weren't collateral damage in a drug operation gone sideways. They were grabbed because one man, a man connected to the cartel who was afraid for his own life, needed to give his boss somebody, anybody, and they were convenient. Think about what that actually means. Two people's entire fates, their lives, their futures, their unborn child, were sealed by a coward's lie, by a mechanic's desperate attempt to protect himself from a violent man who wanted answers. This is how cartel paranoia works, and it's important to understand the mechanics of it because it didn't start and end with Guzman Banda. It's a system. Cartels like the Gulf Cartel don't function like businesses with HR departments and accountability structures. They function on fear, rumor, and power. When something goes wrong, when drugs disappear, when money comes up short, there's no investigation. There's no internal review. There's just pressure flowing downward from the top of the organization through layers of operators until someone at the bottom has to produce an answer. Guzman Banda was at the bottom of one of those layers. He probably didn't steal the drugs himself. He probably didn't know who did, but he was being squeezed by a man who was being squeezed by the organization above him. And in that environment, the safest thing you can do is give someone up. Anyone. Someone the boss hasn't personally vouched for, someone on the outside edge of the circle, someone who has been in the neighborhood but doesn't belong. Luis and Linoshka fit that description perfectly. They were unknown to the cartel's inner circle. They had visited the mechanic's home. That was enough. In the paranoid calculus of cartel logic, an unverified outsider who was present near the time of a theft is, by default, suspicious. They don't need to investigate. They don't need proof. The accusation is the trial. Investigator Rebecca Lopez, who covered this case for years at WFAA, described it bluntly. I have no idea why they were pointed out. I think they were just an easy target because they were there. Easy target. That's it. That's all it took to destroy two lives. And here's the thing that makes this even harder to process. The cartel's pattern recognition instinct, the way they're trained to look for suspicious behavior, actually works against innocent people in a very specific way. Cartel enforcers are conditioned to see everything through a lens of threat assessment. An unfamiliar car on the block, a face they don't recognize, a question that seems slightly off. These details in their world are signals, red flags, evidence of surveillance, of rival operations, of police informants. Luis and Linoshka were in a neighborhood they didn't typically frequent. Luis drove a car that was being dropped off, meaning it came and went without following any regular pattern. They were young, not from the immediate block, and they had some kind of ongoing relationship with the mechanic. To someone whose entire survival depends on identifying threats, that combination of details reads as suspicious. It's irrational. It's paranoid. It's the product of years operating in an environment where the wrong move gets you killed. But it explains, in a clinical way, how a completely innocent young couple becomes a threat in someone else's distorted risk calculation. And once Monarez accepted Banda's story, there was no undoing it. The moment he decided that Luis and Linoshka had stolen from him, they ceased to be people. They became problems, evidence that needed to be contained, bodies that needed to be managed. That's the dehumanizing logic of cartel violence. It strips identity from the target and replaces it with function. You're no longer a young father-to-be, a soccer player from Oak Cliff, a girl who wanted to be a social worker. You are the people who stole from us, and that category has only one resolution. Nicolas Monarez was not a man who second-guessed himself. He was not known, by any account, as someone who paused to consider whether the information he was acting on was accurate. He acted fast, he acted violently, and he expected results. Luis and Linoshka were held at the first location, that shed, and then moved. Court testimony later revealed that the couple was transported between at least two properties over the roughly 2 days they were held captive. Moving captives is a standard cartel procedure. It makes them harder to find. It prevents any one location from becoming compromised, and it keeps the victims disoriented, uncertain of where they are, unable to build any mental map of their surroundings. The interrogations began almost immediately. Monares demanded they tell him where the drugs and cash were. Luis and Lenoshka had nothing to say because they had nothing to give him. There was nothing to confess to. There was no information to offer. And their inability to produce an answer that didn't exist, was read by Monares not as evidence of their innocence, but as defiance. In his world, silence was resistance. Innocence looked exactly like lying. So the interrogations escalated. I'm not going to linger in the specific details of what happened in that shed, because this isn't that kind of story. But you need to know that what they endured was not quick. It lasted 2 days. It involved severe physical trauma. It involved electrical current. It involved the sustained, deliberate infliction of suffering by people who had decided these 2 kids were guilty before they ever walked through the door. Luis, according to testimony from one of the accomplices, who later cooperated with prosecutors, tried to negotiate at some point. He offered to pay money he didn't have, in exchange for Lenoshka's safety. He was pleading for his pregnant girlfriend's life from inside a shed in Oak Cliff, while his family was posting flyers a few miles away. He was 20 years old. She was 18 and 6 months pregnant. At some point during that second night, it ended. The way it ended is almost too bleak to say plainly, but I'm going to say it. The truth never mattered. The questioning never led anywhere real because there was nowhere real for it to go. Luis and Lenoshka couldn't tell the cartel who stole the drugs because they didn't know, and Monares couldn't walk away from 2 witnesses who had seen his face and heard his voice and could identify him to police. They never had a chance. From the moment Guzman Banda pointed his finger at them, there was only one possible ending. The only question was whether anyone on the outside would figure out what happened before the evidence disappeared. Try to imagine for a moment what those hours felt like from the inside. You are bound in a dark space. You don't know exactly where you are. Your hands have been restrained long enough that you've stopped feeling them. The air smells like engine oil and dirt. You hear voices in Spanish, some of it fast, some of it angry, and you can pick out words but not sentences. And you keep telling them the same thing over and over in whatever combination of English and Spanish you can manage. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything. I don't have it. Please. But every time you say it, it doesn't make anything better. It makes it worse. Because in the logic of the room you're in, your denial is confirmation. Your ignorance is resistance. The person you love most is in the same room, and you can hear their voice, and sometimes you can't. And you make yourself not think about what that means. You think about your family. You think about the apartment in Mesquite. You think about the soccer field where everything felt uncomplicated. You think about the daughter you are going to name. You try to hold on to something real, and then the hours blur. The pain becomes familiar in a terrible way. Your body adjusts around it, the way you can get used to cold if you stay in it long enough, except you don't actually get used to it. You just stop being surprised by it. There is no cavalry coming. The Dallas police, when the family tried to report them missing, told them that adults couldn't be reported missing for 48 hours, that Luis and Lenoshka had probably just taken off on their own. Maybe they were out partying. They'd turn up. The detective in charge was dismissive. The family pressed. The hours kept passing. At some point during those 2 days, according to what emerged in the investigation that followed years later, it became clear, even to the men holding them, that something had gone wrong. That the information Guzman Banda had provided didn't hold up. That these 2 were not the people who stole the drugs. But by then, it was too late for that realization to save anyone. Here is the part that makes this story different from every other cartel killing story. Most cartel violence, as brutal as it is, at least operates within a certain cruel logic. Territory disputes, drug debts, rival organizations, informants. This one didn't. Because at some point, we don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly how it registered, the men holding Luis and Lenoshka had to have understood that their information was wrong. 2 days of interrogation had produced nothing. No names of co-conspirators, no location of the stolen goods, no confession that fit any narrative. Because there was no narrative. There was no theft. There was no conspiracy. There was just a mechanic who lied to save himself, and 2 young people paying the price for it. Court testimony from Frank Estrella, who cooperated with prosecutors after his arrest, gave investigators a partial picture of what happened in that shed. The escalation, the desperation, the growing awful recognition that the 2 people they were holding couldn't give them what they wanted because they didn't have it. In a different world, in a world where accountability and mercy existed within that operation, that recognition might have meant something. It might have led to a different outcome, but that's not the world Nicolas Monares operated in. When you're running a cartel cell in Dallas in 2007, the calculus for releasing two people who can identify you is zero. You don't let witnesses walk. You don't absorb a mistake by correcting it. You contain the damage. You eliminate the evidence. That's not a human decision. It's a logistical one. And that's perhaps the most haunting thing about what happened to Luis and Linoshka. In the end, they weren't killed out of rage or revenge or because anyone genuinely believed they were guilty. They were killed because they had been in the room. Monarez covered his tracks the way cartel operators are trained to do. He moved the bodies. He disposed of evidence. He spread stories in the neighborhood that Luis and Linoshka had taken off. Maybe they had relationship problems. Maybe they ran. He counted on confusion and the slow machinery of Dallas law enforcement to buy him time. For weeks it worked. The family didn't stop looking. Rachel Torres, Linoshka's older sister, became the engine of the search. She drove to the mechanic's house repeatedly. Guzman Banda told her he hadn't seen them. She went to the police. The police told her to be patient. She went back to the police. She went to Spanish-language television. She and Luis's family made flyers. They posted them everywhere. They called local journalists, and they waited. 3 days after the couple disappeared, when it became undeniable that something was wrong, the families organized their own search because the official system was moving too slowly, taking reports that went nowhere, treating this as two adults who probably left of their own accord. The red Ford Explorer was still in the mechanic's driveway. The keys were still in the ignition. The cell phones were still on the seat. None of this seemed to produce the urgency it should have. The families knew. They knew something terrible had happened, but knowing and proving are different things. In the days that followed, investigators eventually began to close in on Guzman Banda and his connection to the Gulf Cartel. But the case moved slowly. There were complications. There were evidence problems that would only become clear later. There were detectives who mishandled material in ways that would undermine the entire prosecution. February 10th, 2007, 35 days after Luis and Linoshka went to the mechanic's house, a passerby on Dowdy Ferry Road noticed something in the water beneath the bridge over the creek near Interstate 45. A plastic bag, half submerged. Then another. Police were called. Then more police. Then investigators. Inside the bags were human remains, stripped of clothing, showing evidence of significant trauma. Days of forensic work confirmed what everyone in two families had already felt in their bones since that January evening. Luis Campos, Linoshka Torres, and the child she was carrying, 3 victims. When Rachel Torres was told, she asked the question that has stayed with this case ever since, the question that captures everything about the helplessness and the horror of what happened. Did my sister plead for her life? Did she plead for her baby's life? She never got an answer. Not really. Not one that gave her any peace. Luis's mother told reporters, "You took my son's life. You took my daughter-in-law and granddaughter's life." The grief that comes from this kind of loss is not ordinary grief. It's the kind that comes from knowing that the person you loved died terrified and in pain and without understanding why. That they went to a mechanic's house to pick up a car and never came home. That they were innocent of everything and it didn't matter. That innocence in the world that took them was just another vulnerability to be exploited. The Dallas Medical Examiner's Office confirmed what the family and investigators had feared: blunt force trauma, signs of electrical injury, manual strangulation, 2 days of captivity, 2 days. Shortly after the bodies were found, police arrested Jorge Guzman Banda and Frank Estrella on capital murder charges, 2 arrests, some movement in the case. But the man everyone believed was at the center of it all, Nicolas Monarez, had fled. He was gone, across the border and into Mexico, where American warrants couldn't reach him. He would stay there for 13 years. What followed the arrest was, in some ways, almost as painful for the families as the crime itself. Frank Estrella, who had participated in the kidnapping and witnessed everything that followed, became a cooperating witness. His deal: plead guilty to aggravated kidnapping. Sentence: 15 years. He served 5. He was paroled in 2017. And then, Frank Estrella disappeared. The state of Texas lost track of him. As of the last reporting on this case, authorities were still unable to locate him. 5 years served for helping kidnap, transport, and witness the murder of 3 people. Jorge Guzman Banda, the mechanic who pointed his finger at Luis and Linoshka and started everything, received a similar deal. 15 years, served a fraction of it. Nicolas Monarez finally surfaced in 2020, 13 years after the murders. He was caught trying to cross the border at El Paso. A U.S. Marshal tip, a Border Patrol stop, and suddenly the man who had been running free in Mexico since 2007 was in federal custody. The families, who had waited over a decade for this moment, started to prepare for a trial, for accountability, for some version of justice that felt proportional to what he had done. But there were problems, serious ones. The original detective who handled the case back in 2007 had, according to investigators and sources who spoke to journalist Rebecca Lopez, falsified information on a search warrant and obtained a confession from one of the suspects in a manner that made it legally inadmissible. That confession, which should have been a cornerstone of the prosecution, was tainted. The chain of evidence had been compromised from the beginning, and now, all these years later, the damage couldn't be undone. Prosecutors came to the family not long before the trial was supposed to begin and explained what they were facing. With the confession inadmissible and other evidence weakened by the original mishandling, they couldn't guarantee a conviction at trial. They could guarantee a plea deal. In July 2016, Nicolas Monares, the man who organized the kidnapping, who beat Luis with a bat, who killed Lenoshka with his own hands, pleaded guilty to kidnapping. Not capital murder, not the charge that matched what he'd done, kidnapping. Sentence, 15 years, the same deal as the man who drove the car. Rachel Torres stood up in that courtroom and asked him directly, "Did my sister plead for her life? Did she plead for her baby's life?" She called him a monster. She asked the DA's office why they hadn't consulted the family before finalizing the deal, why she'd received a call about the plea at the last minute, the day before it was finalized. The Dallas County DA's office said in a statement that when there are evidence issues, they plead cases to an amount of guaranteed prison time, rather than take a chance on the defendant walking free from a jury trial. Rachel's response, "We didn't get any justice." But the story wasn't over, because the system still had one more failure left to deliver. Monares, under the terms of his deal, was supposed to serve his 15-year sentence for the kidnapping of Luis and Lenoshka after completing a 10-year federal sentence for a separate drug trafficking conviction. The structure was simple: federal time first, then state time. In February 2021, Rachel Torres received a letter from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Nicolas Monares had been removed from the United States, deported to Mexico. He had served his federal drug sentence, and instead of being transferred to the Texas Department of Corrections to begin his time for the murders, he had been released and sent across the border. A paperwork failure, a communication breakdown between federal and state agencies. Nobody at the Dallas County Sheriff's Department had made sure the transfer happened. Nobody had tracked him through the system. And by the time anyone noticed, by the time Rachel Torres started asking questions, by the time reporter Rebecca Lopez started calling, Monares had been in Mexico for months. The man who murdered Lenoshka Torres, Luis Campos, and their unborn daughter had never served a single day in prison for those killings. He just did the drug charges, Rachel Torres told reporters. That's it. Dallas County District Attorney John Creuzot, who was not DA when the original case was prosecuted, acknowledged the failure directly. There were major failures where paperwork was not properly filed by prosecutors at the time. He said his office was investigating the failure and working to determine whether extradition was possible. As of the most recent reporting on this case, 2025, 18 years after the murders, Monares was still in Mexico, still free. And Frank Estrella, the cooperating witness who served 5 years and was paroled, still missing. The state couldn't find him either. Rachel Torres, who has spent nearly 2 decades fighting for her sister's memory, said it plainly. "When this monster gets out, we are all going to be in trouble. He will do it again." No one in the system has given her reason to believe otherwise. The case of Luis Campos and Lenoshka Torres is not an anomaly. It is an example of a pattern, a recurring, documented, and deeply troubling pattern of innocent people being swept into cartel violence through mistaken identity and paranoid accusation. In March 2023, 16 years after Luis and Lenoshka were killed, 4 Americans from South Carolina drove into Matamoros, Mexico for a medical appointment. Gunmen from a Gulf cartel faction called the Scorpions surrounded their van, opened fire, killed 2 of them, and abducted the survivors. The reason? U.S. officials later determined that the cartel mistook the Americans for Haitian drug smugglers because their van's license plates and tinted windows resembled vehicles used by a rival network. Tinted windows, license plates, that's all it took. After the kidnapping became international news, the Scorpions faction did something almost unprecedented. They published an apology letter. They stated that the gunmen had acted under their own decision-making and lack of discipline. They claimed the cartel respected the life and well-being of the innocent. They turned over the perpetrators. But let's be precise about why that apology happened. Because the victims were American citizens, and the international pressure on the Mexican government and on the cartel's business operations was intense. The apology wasn't about remorse, it was about damage control. When Luis and Lenoshka were killed in Dallas in 2007, there was no apology. There was no letter. There was no accountability from the organization that had allowed one of its operators to grab and murder two innocent people based on a lie. Because Luis and Lenoshka were working-class Mexican-American kids from Oak Cliff, not nationals, not international news. Their deaths didn't threaten trade relationships or diplomatic pressure. They just mattered to the people who loved them. This is the pattern. Cartel cells, operating under pressure to recover stolen goods or demonstrate control, act on unverified information because speed and decisiveness are valued over accuracy. Mid-level operators like Monarez, caught between the demands of leadership above them and their own need to project competence, don't have the luxury of careful investigation. They see someone who could be the answer to their problem, and they act. The mechanics lie, the cartel's paranoia, the detective's misconduct, the DA's evidence problems, the paperwork failure at the jail. Each of those elements individually might have been survivable. Together, they produced a chain of catastrophic failures that took 3 lives, destroyed 2 families, and let the primary perpetrator walk free to Mexico without ever facing justice for what he did. And somewhere in the background of all of this is the broader reality of the Gulf Cartel's presence in North Texas, a presence that federal law enforcement documented extensively, but that ordinary residents in neighborhoods like Pleasant Grove and Oak Cliff often encountered at the ground level in the form of a mechanic who did discount work, a neighbor who drove nice cars, a low-level operator trying to protect himself from a violent boss. The cartel's cells in American cities depend on blending in. They depend on the trust of communities that don't know what's underneath the surface. And when that trust gets weaponized, when a local connection becomes the mechanism by which the cartel identifies and acts against innocent people, there are no second chances. Luis Campos didn't get a second chance. Lenoshka Torres didn't get one. Their daughter, who never got a name used in public because she was never born into the world she was supposed to enter, didn't get one either. There is a MySpace page, remember MySpace, that was set up in 2007 as a tribute to Luis and Lenoshka. It's still there, frozen in time, the way digital memorials sometimes are. Photos of 2 young people who are figuring out how to be adults, how to be partners, how to be parents. Comments from people who knew them, posted in the weeks and months after the bodies were found, full of grief and disbelief and love. That page has outlasted the investigation that was supposed to deliver justice. It has outlasted the plea deals and the paroles and the paperwork failures. It has outlasted the detective who falsified evidence and the DA who couldn't make the case stick and the immigration system that misplaced a murderer. It is, in some quiet way, more durable than any of it. Rebecca Lopez, the journalist who covered this case for WFAA for years and keeps returning to it, said something in one of her reports that I think is worth holding on to. She described the story of Luis and Lenoshka as the most troubling story I've covered in my 37 years in journalism. Not because of the level of violence, she's covered violence before, but because of the perfect, horrible convergence of failures. The lie that started it, the institutional failures that followed, and the knowledge that the man responsible is alive and free right now, somewhere in Mexico, while Rachel Torres lives with the weight of a letter from ICE that told her what happened. Rachel Torres said it directly when confronted with that reality. They were never supposed to be targets. That sentence deserves to echo, because it is, in every sense, true. They were never supposed to be targets. They were never supposed to be in the cartel's orbit at all. They were supposed to pick up a car and go to a family dinner and celebrate the end of the Christmas season with the people they loved. And none of what happened to them was inevitable. It required a specific accumulation of human failures, a frightened mechanic's lie, a violent man's paranoia, a detective's misconduct, a system's negligence, all lined up in sequence, each one enabling the next. We talk about cartel violence like it's a force of nature, like a hurricane, unstoppable and indiscriminate. And in some of its forms, maybe that's not totally wrong. But the story of Luis and Lenoshka was built from choices. The choice to lie, the choice to act on rumor without verification, the choice to kill witnesses instead of accepting the error, the choice to mishandle evidence, the choice to take a plea that didn't fit the crime, the choice to let the paperwork slide. Every one of those choices had a person making it. And because of those choices, a pregnant 18-year-old and her 20-year-old boyfriend never made it to Three Kings Day dinner. I want to end on this because it's important. Families like the Torres family and the Campos family are not unusual. They're not remarkable in their suffering. Every year, in cities across this country and along the border, there are people who end up in situations like this, caught in the shadow architecture of organized crime that exists a few degrees of separation from ordinary life. They call the police and are told to wait 48 hours. They go to the media. They make flyers. They keep asking questions when every institution around them is failing to answer. Rachel Torres has been asking questions for 18 years. She hasn't stopped. She's learned the language of the legal system, the rhythms of the press, the mechanics of ICE notifications. She has become, through grief and necessity, a kind of expert in the failures that killed her sister. She deserves better than that. She always did. And Luis deserved to play soccer. And Lenoshka deserved to become a social worker. And their daughter deserved a name. They were never supposed to be targets. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you think this kind of thing doesn't happen enough in the news, doesn't get treated with the weight it deserves, share this video. Let people know their names. Luis Campos, Lenoshka Torres. They were real people, and what happened to them should not be forgotten.